And we're live 4 minutes late. Because why did you think you deserve to have us be on time? It is Tuesday, June 2nd, 2020, 5:04 p.m. Blame YouTube, don't blame me. I picked go live at 5 o'clock as I always do, and it just didn't work for 4 minutes. So take it up with YouTube. I received a text message today from one Kate Klonick, and it read, "I'm really trying to keep my head above total despair today. I don't know if it's that everything is coated in a thin film of yellow dust and that there is no end in sight of the pandemic, or the riots, the violent riots and underlying systemic racism of our fundamental institutions. Ha, 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 ha."
I didn't even read that, Ben.
I want to say a few words, keeping your head above total despair. Inspired by a lecture we received yesterday from Virginia Heffernan about how to give impromptu monologues, I am speaking with no notes, no pre-thought out ideas, just a script that I got from Kate in the form of this text message about total despair. Number one, the thin film of yellow dust is the problem. Everything else is just the circumstances in the world. But when God sends, on top of the systemic racism, on top of the pandemic, on top of the plague of cicadas that is rising out of the earth in the mid-Atlantic states, a thin film of yellow dust, that is just adding insult to injury. And that is designed to take a hand, put it on your head, and push it down under the water of total despair. And when God does that to you, you have to look up and blow away the dust and say, fuck that. I'm not succumbing to the hand that is pushing me down. And you've got to do something that gives you that extra buoyancy to push up the hand of God as it is shooting you down. Now, what are the things that we can do? Like just snap your fingers and make the systemic racism, the police violence against protesters, or the COVID-19 pandemic go away. You can't, and that's why I have alcohol. I don't know. I say to us all, resist the despair, resist the thin yellow cloud of dust. We are not allowed to have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we have Alex Stamos. And by the way, he was not covered with a thin film of yellow dust because he lives in the Bay Area where there is no dust. There is just sunshine. And Alex, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm a little confused as to what's happening right now.
We've replaced Boris Johnson news and Kim Jong-un news and Murder Hornet news with a monologue at the start of the thing. That's what's happening. But thank you for joining us. The thin film of yellow dust, to be clear, I will go take a picture of it. I don't think anyone of you will believe me. It is like the oak trees in Cape Cod just like spew out so much pollen that cars are covered in it. It really does look like ash, except it's yellow and it gets in your eyes and it's itchy. And it's just disgusting. And it's like on everything. And you can't So anyways, that's what I was complaining about.
Okay. I was very confused. I felt like we should get Ben 2 cardboard slates to have over his body as he gives that speech about the yellow dust coming.
I think that
the dust is near.
I think the thin film of first of all, it wasn't me who brought up the thin film of yellow dust. It was Kate. So Kate needs the cardboard sandwich and the end of the world sign, not me. I'm
going to prove this to you guys because no one's going to believe how bad it is. It's like literally in drifts on my deck right now. It's just like, it's disgusting. Anyway, it does feel end of the world.
how thick is it at its thickest point?
Probably like a centimeter, like on like a drift, like of pollen. That's like a lot of pollen.
Yeah, that's kind of a thick film of yellow dust, actually.
Yeah, it's just, yeah. Anyways, I don't want to take up the whole show with yellow dust.
I really don't think that's totally appropriate, really. Let's just complain about what's wrong with Cape Cod.
I know, right? Yeah. This is why
Alex,
I was
what
very
the fuck is
comfortable
going on
sending
at
you this thing.
Facebook?
What did you just say?
I said, what the fuck is going on at Facebook?
Okay, hold on. We have to introduce Alex. I have to share my mail day.
Yeah.
And then let's do that. So, okay. So first, before I introduce Alex, I want to share that, as you know, like last Wednesday night, really late, I posted a draft of the president's executive order on social media online. It kind of got a lot of coverage and pickup, and then he signed it the next day in a final draft. And today, I got very nervous because I went to my mailbox and there was a manila envelope, and in the return address was from the White House. And I was like, it was like full of stuff. And I was like, should I like get someone to bomb sniff this? Or like, is this like a very lumpy subpoena? Like, I have no idea what this is. And inside was the President Trump's one of his official pens for signing the executive order. It has his signature on the back of it, and it is literally a giant Sharpie marker, because you could not make this up. This is the president that we have. If you don't have fine motor control, you can use this pen to sign official executive documents as the president of the United States.
You criticized his draft EO. And
someone sent me one of his.
Troll you. Do you know which person sent it?
I do, but I can't say.
Okay. And is that actually? I mean, that's one of his signing pens. Was that the pen you used?
What do you say?
Was it sent in camaraderie or to mock you?
It came with a note that I will read in part. That's also on White House stationery that says, "Guaranteed to impress and intimidate your adversaries."
Wow.
All right.
Okay.
It's the evidence that somebody in the Trump White House has at least a little bit of self-awareness and a sense of humor.
As someone has just pointed out, could use this to make my own weather maps, or
right.
or alter them, or just draw mustaches on everyone that I don't like.
Or maybe sign EOs.
Or sign EOs. It is not the actual pen, in answer to your question. They don't give the actual pen. I would have to disinfect it if that was the case. It is it is one of the commemorative pens they hold together. But this is like, I have had like a commemorative pen from other like executive signings, not EOs, but from other presidents. They are not giant Sharpie markers. Let me just say, they are not markers like a marker that you wouldn't want to give to a small child, because they might make a mistake and it's not reversible.
Right. I don't let my kids use those. Yeah. Yeah.
Can we make this the official executive order pencils with big erasers at the top or something?
Yeah.
Anyway.
I actually think what we need for executive orders is a shredder.
Well,
just saying.
Matches, a pack of matches.
Welcome back to the show.
Hey, how you doing?
Kate, you were going to introduce Alex.
Oh man, we're stepping all over each other's toes today. Alex, it was so great to have you back. We have not had you on by yourself yet, and I'm super excited for this, especially with everything that's been going on in the last week. Alex is to those who are not aware, Alex is the director of the Internet Observatory at Stanford, an adjunct professor at Stanford. And prior to going to Stanford, he was the CSO at Facebook, and before that, the chief security officer at Yahoo. And so he just has a tremendous amount of knowledge about how a lot of the technical aspects of how these things work, probably more so than I would say like most of the people that are working on making the policy in Washington on all of these things. And it's always great to talk to you. And I'm so excited to hear what the Internet Observatory is doing with mis and disinformation around the elections, around COVID, around everything that's happening right now, but also to kind of get you some of your just kind of like off the cuff or thoughts about the tech wars that are going on content moderation right now and everything else between Twitter and Facebook.
Sure. So where do you want to start? That was a lot of stuff.
Well, let's start with what's going on let's start with what's going on at Facebook, because they seem to have actually had resignations today, or at least one. I did not, I've been aware that there have been there was discontent with Facebook's or Mark Zuckerberg's stance with respect to the president's postings, but it does seem to be reaching a kind of critical mass of anger. And I guess my question is, of all the issues that could rile up Facebook employees, why this one?
Right. Well, I think this, to use the overused metaphor, I think this is the straw that broke the camel's back for a number of employees, right? So I actually had 4 people call me this weekend, or since Friday, looking for help finding other jobs. So Facebook employees, you've got my phone probably. Yeah, a lot of people are looking. And I think there's a couple of things going on. So on this particular issue, I think it actually is like a legitimately hard content policy issue of how do you handle democratically elected leaders of countries, right? And what rules do you apply and what moderation decisions you make. I think Twitter's actually taken a pretty reasonable stance here because, I think the problem with anybody, and there's a problem with all like leaders of democracies. So there's a problem with government leaders, which is you're trying to stay legal in that country. You're trying to keep your people from getting arrested. So there's a constant tension of fights with governments. And in non-democracies, that can get really rough. And traditionally, Facebook's pushed back pretty hard against that. I think something that I saw that I was not super happy about was Facebook actually conceding to the Vietnamese government and doing some things when like there was a big battle with the Vietnamese when I was there, including them trying to hack people and stuff like that. And I felt like we acted pretty well. And it seems like maybe a lot of things have shifted towards staying legal in as many places as possible and away from taking stands on a human rights basis against authoritarian governments. So you have that. You have the problem of leaders of all democracies, right? Of the idea of, what these people say is newsworthy. And if what they say is either incorrect or has the possibility of causing harm, it's also newsworthy. How do you handle it? And then you have the specific problem with Donald Trump, which is it is effectively impossible to deplatform the president of the United States, right? Like everything he says is newsworthy. And the crazier it is that he says stuff becomes more newsworthy, right? Like if he was kicked off Twitter and Facebook and he went to Gab and he said horrible, he basically said, I'm going to invade Minnesota, right? With the 82nd Airborne. That's going to be in every newspaper. That's going to be on television. That's going to be posted over and over again on those sites. And so when you create policies of these companies, you don't just think about like what's happening right now. You have to think about what the knock-on effects are, right? And the knock-on effects there is you can't deplatform him unless you're willing to delete effectively every legitimate media article about it. Like, and I disagree with Mark Zuckerberg. I also think there's a lot of people in the media who are being very hypocritical on this. Like the television networks, there's a lot of friends of mine who work at television networks who are really kind of dunking on Facebookers right now, where the television networks were carrying Donald Trump's live press conferences, which was 100% disinformation. And because of the format, they have almost no way to fact checking in real time. Like sometimes they change the little bottom third, but they're spreading as misinformation. The New York Times article about this tweet and this Facebook post had the tweet in the Facebook post, right? So this is actually a legitimate problem for the traditional media too. Is like, how do you cover a president who just lies all the time, right? And that is lying all the time. And then occasionally not is just lying, but is saying things that might actually induce people to harm. And so that's actually a really hard problem that a lot of people are dealing with. And a lot of people are making it like a super simple, imagining it's super simple when you talk about Facebook or Twitter, but then they ignore the fact that their own outlets. And I think the New York Times is the worst on this. Like, if you see how they've been editing their stories today to kind of normalize the invasion of Washington, D.C. by the active duty military, it's a little disgusting. And so, and the fact that like the same people who are like getting their sick dunks in aren't addressing that at all. That's one of the reasons people in tech industry don't really trust the media, is like, oh, you're dealing with the same problem here. Instead of talking about it as like a big problem, you want to dunk on one company, right? That being said, I disagree with Zuck's position here, because I think Twitter found the good medium, which is you allow it to exist. You allow it to exist in one place, but then you're able to use your own First Amendment right to say, we judge that this is incorrect, or we judge that this is violent.
Which I just want to say, though, that
happens too. Sorry.
I just want to say really quickly is that they're not judging that it's incorrect. They're not like stating that. Like this, like there, it wasn't even an interstitial either. It was just a thing that they stuck on the edge of Trump's tweets that was like an exclamation. It's like, read more facts. It was like, in addition, like the implication was that it was untrue, but it wasn't.
That was
like
the voting
casting
one.
judgment.
For the violence one is an interstitial that I saw.
The violence one is an interstitial, but that happened after the executive order on Friday.
Right. And so I think what happens here is, I think that's an appropriate thing, because it exists. You're not trying to deplatform the leader of a country, but you're also not giving them reach, right? So like you're allowing expression, and you're allowing the kind of newsworthiness to exist for people to link back to it to criticize it, but you're not allowing it to spread on its own. Because like when they do those tags, you can't retweet it without, you can't like it. There's a bunch of stuff. It probably gets downranked. And I think that's an appropriate place. And the counterexample here of like the things that where this didn't happen, where it really backfired, was first a year ago, which it feels like a decade ago. There was this video of Nancy Pelosi going around of her slowed down, right? It was like a cheap fake. It was something that my kids.
It was May 23rd, 2019. It was just a week and a year ago.
Yeah, right. And so that was taken down and then reposted over and over and over again. And the companies didn't go kind of hardcore in taking it down, because it's very hard. It's like core political speech criticizing an elected official, right? Like it's hard, it's hard to argue you should use the same kind of weaponry you use against child exploitation or a snuff film like the Christchurch video against a video criticizing Nancy Pelosi. And the result was, instead of having it in one place where they could have debunked it and said this is false, you end up within 10,000 places, right? And that's exactly what happened in the pandemic video, which is this video full of totally crazy misinformation, like wearing a mask reactivates the virus in your body, just totally nutso stuff. So you're not talking about like arguing with who over masks or something. You're talking about stuff that is obviously incorrect. And the companies under pressure, YouTube and Facebook especially, took it down. As a result, you had this demand for it that was then matched by tens of thousands of people. And so we did a whole post, io.stanford.edu, where we tracked how many people saw Plandemic and then how many people saw the response videos. And not a lot of people saw the responses. And why? Because you didn't have that choke point. So I think especially in a disinformation situation where you can correct the incorrect information, allowing it to exist, downranking, creating the choke point, marking it, and then pushing people, that's probably the best you can do. Right. Now, on the calls to violence, I think it is a much harder call. But again, like if he's not calling out an individual and he's saying like, I'm basically going to do something violent at using my power of the presidency, I think, again, that's newsworthy. That is going to be front page news on every newspaper in the country. And so allowing the one to exist, but it's hard to find it, you have to go get to it, I think is a reasonable compromise. And so what's happening in Facebook now is that Mark doesn't want to make that compromise. I think there's arguments both sides. I think the thing that Mark Zuckerberg has done that is not conscionable is during this time, he's calling up Trump on the phone, right? And that's where all of these kinds of excuses of, we have these rules and we're applying them fairly fall away when it's also clear you're trying to curry favor from your most important regulator in the world. And I think one of the things that's been under discussed for the last year that has now come to the forefront is the Trump administration's been getting ready for this, and that they've been working the refs pretty hard over the last year by announcing all these investigations. They never settle. They never finish, right? So it's just all open investigations into all these different business practices. And for the most part, the media is kind of like taking that at face value. Like, oh, Ben Carson really cares about the Fair Housing Act. And that's why he's going after, for the Fair Housing Act, Twitter, Facebook, and Google, certainly the worst slumlords on the planet, right? And there might be a legitimate argument that they did something wrong, but that's not why the Trump administration is going after them. They're going after them to say we can pick a fight on whatever ground we want, and we have the power of the executive branch behind us. And that is now coming to a head right now, is the year of basically the administration building all of these cases. DOJ just announced a big investigation of Google for antitrust. There's some interesting antitrust issues with Google. The idea that they're like the most monopolistic, like they haven't done any other antitrust stuff. The idea that Google's like the worst monopoly in the country is just ridiculous. Like if you're starting of companies that have monopolies, Google is not in your top 5. They're doing it because Google owns YouTube, right? That's it. There's
it's because it's just power chasing after power, which is like Washington wants in on like the Silicon Valley power that they have ignored for forever because they just didn't think that they thought it was like kind of like kids with toys. They didn't really get it. They didn't understand how it could be consolidated or how much power it could wield. And now I think that they finally do. I just want to show really quickly, just for like explanatory purposes, this is when I was describing, this happened on May 26th. So this was Tuesday afternoon. This was this was not an interstitial, just to be clear. This is just a notification label, get the facts about mail-in ballots. That this was what set off the executive order. And then I'm gonna flip through a bunch of stuff. And this was the interstitial that was published on Friday that he's tweeted. And if you clicked through on this, this is the interstitial that kind of like covered whatever his tweet was. His tweet was, this was the looting, when the looting starts, the shooting starts tweet. And the interstitial remains at the top as a label if you click through. And I'm just like letting people, sorry to like kind of be basic, but Alex, you know all of this, Ben knows all of this, but I just kind of like, people don't understand always what we mean by interstitial and like what some of this terminology is. So it's, I think, useful to kind of spell out. And if you click here, learn more, it goes to like Twitter's help center and allows you to read all about their public interest exceptions. To your point, Alex, about how this stuff works and the reason the media covers this poorly and everyone piles onto one tech company and the other tech company, I feel like it's all outcome, like it's because everyone is outcome driven and not principle driven. Like no one wants, like everyone just wants Trump's shit taken down, or then they want like the Nancy Pelosi video taken down, or then they want such and such taken down. I was in this to the Nancy Pelosi topic. And Ben, I'm curious if you remember this incident and if you have like, if what your experience with it was, because I do think that it was so polemic. I was actually in I was covering the Facebook oversight board and it just started, and we were doing group workshops with people from all over the world, right? And in these like 60-person workshop stakeholders, like big, smart, thoughtful people and like free expression. And I did one in New York and I did one in Berlin. And at both of them, people brought up the Pelosi video and people were just like, they should have taken that down. And if you'll remember, YouTube said they'd take it down. Facebook said no, Twitter said no. And then as you stated before, it proliferated. There was no choke point. There was no ability to kind of control it or make anyone clear in it. But what was so fascinating is I'm sitting next to this woman. I'll never forget this conversation. And I just was like, but like, what if that was satire? Like if you had slowed down and made Donald Trump sound like that, like, cause she was obviously the liberal, or she was European, but like she was anti-Trump. That was clear. And I was like, if they had done,
unless you're one of like the nationalist parties in Europe, you're probably not a Trump fan, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so I was kind of like, hey, so like, what do you, what if this was satire? How would you distinguish this from satire or something like that? And she goes, well, it just wasn't. And even if it was, she's a public figure. And then I was like, kind of like, you could tell that it was like clicking. And she was like, I had given the example of Trump. And he's like, oh, Trump is a political figure too, or like a public figure. And she's like, oh. And then she just kind of got really frustrated and was like, well, it's just fake news. And they just like, there's this, like this tribal retreat to this these completely neutral kind of biteless, like, I don't know what the word for them is, but just like these like aphorisms almost, like just like free speech is good, more speech is good, but bad speech is bad and bad speech should go away. And like,
and bad speech is the speech that I think is bad.
Right. And
like,
so then you just kind of get into this problem and like, I'm just kind of,
well, that's not a theoretical. Jimmy Kimmel is the one that invented that bit. He has a bunch of bits where he slows down Trump and Trump sounds like a drunk. and it's kind of funny. And his videos were all over Facebook. And that's why I think, like, honestly, for the edited video stuff, the solution is you have a label that says this is a edited video. This is a modified video, right?
Or that
why isn't labeling more generally a good solution? I mean, if it's good enough for the tobacco industry. It's good enough for, campaign finance political ads where Donald Trump has to show up and say, I'm Donald Trump and I approve this message, right? And, I'm not like, I find Twitter's solution to this relatively elegant, except that they do it so sporadically. So,
right.
They put a big bullshit label on the voting stuff, but they don't when he accuses Scarborough of murdering somebody.
Right.
And I don't know why, like, the right answer to this problem isn't more of what Kate just described, which is them just kind of exercising their own First Amendment rights to slap kind of red light, green light, yellow light warnings on
so much work.
Different tweets.
It's a lot of work.
I don't know. Yeah.
But fine, it's not that much work for the president. I mean, this is also where you have to decide, like, are we just going to treat Bolsonaro, Trump, Modi? Like, there are world leaders who use Twitter very effectively, who also say dangerous things. Should you have people, like, it is not a scale problem to deal with their tweets, right?
Yeah, so why
maybe
not
then
just
you don't apply that
say,
to people who
if you have more
followers.
than 80 million followers, we're going to treat you differently.
Right. Yeah. I think that's actually a totally reasonable standard, is that you have a standard either for, like, government leaders, or more likely on just a quantitative follower count above X million followers. If you have a blue check mark and you have X million followers, then these are the rules we're going to apply. And I think that's not an unreasonable solution, because the problem
blue check
that, like,
mark, really? They have, like, I just think the blue check mark was like given out like a party favor with no meaning for such a long period of time that, like, I kind of think, but maybe.
There's all kinds of problems with blue check mark. Like, the biggest problem with the blue check mark is you can change your name and you keep the check mark. So I saw somebody who wrote their name as Black Lives Matter in solidarity, but it looks like they're an official spokesperson for Black Lives Matter.
I saw that person too.
Maybe I'll change my name to Alex
official
Stamos.
Black Lives Matter person.
Yeah.
You have to check their underlying handle.
Alex Stamos.
Sorry, yeah, I don't play those games, but it's like, Sarah John demonstrated this. She got a check mark, and then she named herself a literal Psyduck forever, right? Like, and it was a demonstration of it being silly. But yeah, I mean, I think the Twitter approach is actually fine. I think you can apply it to over X million followers. The point here is that you have to realize, like, the base. I think the public debate with folks in the media and politicians, where it breaks down, is they don't accept a basic precept, which is, it is actually not possible to stop people from getting access to information they want to get access to. It's not possible, right? So if somebody wants it, if there's demand and there is supply, you cannot stop demand and supply from meeting each other on the internet anymore. That world is over. That used to be the world, right? And, there were some better things about the world in which 45 or 50 middle-aged white guys decided what was newsworthy. And that's a world in which we never talked about things like Me Too. We never talked about things like Black Lives Matter. These are humongous problems, in the 1980s, right? But, it was a small number of corporations controlled the media, and they had editorial staffs, and a non-diverse set of people got to decide what was newsworthy, right? And you can try to fix the amplification problem, but you can't fix the actual access problem. And so you might as well just accept the fact that if somebody says something or they put out a video, it is very likely that somebody will be able to get access to it if they look for it. And then you reduce the ability for that to spread virally. And then for people who do seek it out, you attach as many warnings as possible. And then the rest of it is the reality, right? Like, you can't have, I sometimes have this argument with folks who, like, it seems that they want, like, perfect information control. And I'm terrified of that world, right? Because the other thing we got to remember is, like, Donald Trump's not going to be president forever, or even if he is, like, who has the power of the regulatory state behind them, right? Like, and the idea that these companies, if you give them the power, they're going to act in a way that's consistent with your own personal political goals is just silly. And so I think the Pelosi video is a great example. It's also a great example of the Democratic Party does not know how to handle disinformation, right? And this is something I've talked to a number of people about. It's like the absolute worst way to handle disinformation is to say, oh my God, look at this thing. Look how horrible it is. Look at it. Look at it. Look how horrible it is. Look at it. So that video had like 50,000 views or something until people kind of on the left-wing side in the media started picking it up. And then it got millions of views from all these different uploads. So you just, like, I got interviewed on MSNBC about it. And while they're interviewing me, they're playing about how horrible the video is. They're playing the video. And so it's like, you just can't fight disinformation that way, right? You have to, like, in a situation like that, you just have to kind of ignore it. In a situation like Trump lying about something, you need to provide the alternative view and then reduce the spread. If it is like a violent threat, I think the interstitial is a reasonable thing. There's probably also a step at which you just take it down, which I think is probably like if you're calling, if the president said something about who will rid me of this meddling priest effectively, right? Like if he had some kind of obvious kind of physical threat to somebody, to an individual's safety, then you probably have to take it down. Now, taking it down won't actually fix anything because, again, it will be covered all over the place, but just so you don't have a moral part. But to answer your first question, which you asked like half an hour ago, Ben, I think what's happening at Facebook is the problem is that the leadership there has drifted away from a bunch of the principles that they've talked about internally around transparency, around openness in communication. And things have become very, very political up top. And the thing that set the stage for this was the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, right? That Joel Kaplan, the head of policy, is like besties with Brett Kavanaugh, and he was sitting behind him at his hearings. Apparently no other executives at Facebook knew that was going to happen. It became a whole brouhaha, and Mark stood behind him. And then that kind of set the stage of like, maybe our executives are actually deeper into this than just being neutral arbiters. And I think if you're going to make a call one way or another, you can't be like, oh, well, I just got off the phone with the president, right? Like that is just pushing people past the edge of the idea of him standing on some kind of free expression principle, which again, I don't really agree with him of how he's deciding, but you can argue it. But it's hard to make that argument if you're also currying favor with the White House, right? And that's, I think, over the edge.
And how do you understand the currying favor? Is it a survival mechanism in the context of all these investigations and regulatory authority? Is it a reflection of, some, I mean, it's not a deep political sympathy, but he's the same age and sort of as Jared and Ivanka. Is there some social dimension to it? How do you understand what's behind the hobnobbing?
So, I mean, part of it, this is like, just like in the government, personnel is policy, right? And the VP of global policy was the deputy chief of staff for a Republican president and is deeply entwined in Republican politics. And so
this is Joel Kaplan.
Yeah. I have, since I've left, I've tried not to get into personal stuff with people because I do think there's a lot of kind of structural things that are a bigger deal than personal things. But I think in this case, it's a big deal. Because the other thing that you have to understand is like a fundamental problem at Facebook is there's two policy teams that are really smushed together under Joel that have two totally different missions. One of theirs is the mission of deciding what should happen on this platform based upon a diverse, this kind of set of not very well understood principles. This is kind of the oversight board stuff that Kate's doing. This is where they need to get like much firmer and better about figuring out what those principles are and stuff. But there's a team who has to do that. The other team that sits right next to them is the team who has to keep governments happy with them, right? And now this has mostly been, historically, this has been a problem outside of the US. And that you find that the people who are working on policy issues in countries are pulled from the ruling party, right? Because by definition, like if they're in a government relations role, it's their job to have a good relationship with the current government. And so they're often related to the ruling party. That means they're probably from the majority and the powerful ethnicity. They're from the majority religion, language, caste, depending on the country. There's all kinds of divisions between people that are relevant. So, for example, in Turkey, a lot of the people who make these decisions are pretty close to the Erdogan government. what do you think they think about Kurds? Do you think they're big fans of the PKK and Kurdish liberation? No. And so you end up with a situation where the people who are keeping them, who are like very strong voices in the debate about what is the definition of terrorism, are also predisposed to one country's definition of terrorism. And I think we're now seeing that pattern here in the US, that, this started when I was still at Facebook, and that, there's a government relations shop that is just like any K Street shop. When the party in power changes, the people in the room change. And so the Republicans became ascendant and the Democrats became much less powerful. And now you have like a significant number of kind of institutional Republicans in really important roles. And I think there that having the same people be responsible for like keeping the government happy and having them try to come up with these decisions is just the wrong way. And if you look at like some of the stories about how Twitter made the decision, it sounds like that's not true there. And there's no reason for that to be true other than some kind of weird historical stuff based upon some people who have left. And so I think that's a fundamental problem, because then personnel is policy, because those are the people who bring you your options, right? And the other problem at Facebook is that a lot of the people who make decisions have been there forever. They're spectacularly rich. The definition I use for this is if you fly private, right? Like, that's like the last kind of step where you completely disconnect yourselves from people who are merely, well off, to being like generationally rich, is that you don't even have to interact with people in the airport back when airports existed. And so you have these people who are kind of isolated. And then, so what options come to them are extremely important as to then what decisions are made on the back end, right? And so if you don't have two very credible voices in the room who have completely different equities, who are fighting about it, it's much less likely that the person up top is going to make the right decision. And I think that's one of the things that these protesters at Facebook are basically trying to do, is they're trying to pop through that bubble, right? And that there really is a bubble around Mark in leadership at Facebook of, and that bubble kind of self-selects for yes people. It's not just yes men, there are women in that too, but I think people are trying to pop that a bit through their resignations and the like.
I think that there's something really fascinating about what you just said, which is that like in talking to some of I've always like kind of disambiguated the two groups that I've spent time with at Facebook. I spent almost no time with the C-suite, the people that you're kind of talking about. I've spent all of my time mostly very interested in the actual, and trying to figure out actually how things work and how things are like turned into product or things are turned into policy, and very little time in like wasting. I've tried to waste as little time as possible in like the going ons of the upper level, because it just seems unreachable and unchangeable. But that's actually part of what I think is interesting, because in the past 5 years, I think there's been a huge sea change in how people see these private platforms as governing public rights, and like a much more sophistication around this. And I think that employees, to a certain extent, see themselves as the last stand of some type of accountability to the C-suite that is entrenched, that right. is kind of like in these positions. And that's why you're getting this type of action right now. I don't know. Does that seem right to you, or?
Yeah, I think you're right. Silicon Valley,
I'm not saying that it is representative, obviously. I'm just saying that like, I feel like that's right. like what the employees are feeling.
So, the thing that conservatives say that is true is that the employee base trends to the left, right? I have no problem with that. So I was in that category of people. And so I think that ends up with people then at the executive level trying very hard to counteract their own natural tendencies of being people who like coastal elites who live in the Bay Area, who go to pride marches and the like. And so like they're always kind of questioning themselves. And so I think that causes problems. But like specifically at Facebook, one of the issues has been, I think one of the problems has historically been, it's not true for this problem, but for a lot of these problems, they're not really kind of policy problems. They're really problems about bending the curve on how the product is built, and to make sure the product is built in a way to not cause these harms. And that's something the company has not done a very good job around. And partially it's because there's been way too much focus on individual decisions versus bending the curve. And I think some of the employees are now waking up to that, because it felt like from the inside, so like my job was just to handle bad shit all the time. Like our team was just enmeshed in badness. We had nothing fun. Every staff meeting was like, oh, well, we stopped a attack by this Iranian group. And we're like, yay, something didn't happen. And that is the best thing that I'm going to hear today, that we stopped, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps from owning up 100 activists, right? Everything else was worse from that, because those are things that actually happened that now we had to deal with, right? That's not true for most of the company, where they are metricked on how, measured on like how well the product's doing, how much people enjoy it and the like. And those parts of the company, I think, didn't really understand their responsibility for thinking about misuse and bending the curve, because a lot of these decisions were pushed to be decisions of like, oh, well, we'll take something down, right? We'll make content decisions. And so I think that's the other thing that's going on now, is that you no longer have this. There was like lots of people that got to live in this bubble. And finally that bubble is popped of all the engineers and product people and folks who didn't have to deal with the horribleness every day, that they have some kind of responsibility for it. And I think, that maybe has changed a bit too. From what I've heard, it's also, one of the problems is it's become a big company. And so like internal communications are much less, it used to be extremely open. People took a lot of feedback well and such. At least that was the theory. At the top levels of the company, it's always been kind of Game of Thrones, right? But at least they gave lip service. And my understanding is a lot of that's changed in the last year or so, as it's gone bigger, as some different people have come in and they've really kind of cracked down on some internal dissent. And I think you're seeing some of that pushback too.
And why has that changed? Is it just a wagon circling in response to all the pressure they've been under?
I think it's partially wagon circling. Yeah. And one of the truth is that a lot of stuff that's written about Facebook isn't true, right? And so you end up, if you're inside the company and you're reading something in the New York Times and you're like 70% of this is not right, then it makes you instantly feel like everybody's out to get you and that there's no legitimate. Now, there's often in the things people say, there's often a kernel of truth. But again, it's like, oh, here's a big problem that lots of people are dealing with. Or, yeah, it's a problem, but like there's actually a reason why things are this way. There's a lot of really hard trade-offs in some of these decisions that then don't get discussed on the outside. And so you'll have people who spend 3 weeks working on some kind of really hard problem, and then it gets super diluted down by some politician saying that this is obviously the wrong thing because they haven't thought through the problem. And that you run into that all the time when you're in a situation where you're dealing with speech globally in a way that nobody's had to do that before. And so I think that does cause a circle the wagons, but then it also then makes the same people immune from legitimate criticisms, which then kind of just bounce off.
We should take some questions because we've got a pile up of them.
Yeah, we do.
I don't know how to pronounce your name. Is it Chailuv Gidwani?
Yeah, that's right.
Lucky guess. The floor is yours.
You nailed it. Yeah, thank you. Should I go ahead? Sorry.
Indeed.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of a general question that kind of comes up whenever the topic of what Facebook should do gets discussed. But is the incentive to increase usage of the platform by the users, do you feel that's like fundamentally incompatible with the social responsibility to prevent some of the horribleness you're talking about? Do you feel like those are like generally counter to each other? Or do you think there's a way to reconcile those?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some problems that is definitely true. So in a lot of the problems in the developing world, the fact that Facebook was just by default available in lots of languages, and that there was a goal of growing use without first thinking through what is really special about that country and what are the risks here, that is certainly it. For stuff in the US, that's much less of an issue, right? Like Facebook's been at a reasonable steady state of what its user base looks like in North America and Europe. I mean, it goes up a little bit, but like that's not like a big driver of that. I think it's a much bigger when you talk about Myanmar or Sri Lanka, some sub-Saharan African countries, or North Africa too, for that matter. Like the goal of making this thing usable by everybody, but then not moving fast enough to then build all the infrastructure necessary to deal with the reality of that is one of the problems. But it's not. There's a lot of people on the outside who like to just come up with like, oh, well, here's the one base issue, right? Like it's a great way to sell an academic book. So like if somebody uses the term surveillance capitalism, that's how I know they haven't really thought about these problems. Because eventually these are like just fundamental problems of freedoms and equities.
Oh man, sweet dig on Shoshana.
Well, I'm just saying, like, I feel like that's kind of the goop of tech policy criticism, right? Like it's like Gwyneth Paltrow.
I don't
like,
disagree with you. I just want to say.
It makes people feel like you read that book and you're like, I'm morally superior to these people in Silicon Valley. And, if you're ever reading something that makes you feel like you would do so much a better job than other people, then it might be catering to your instincts and not really making you think. Because a lot of these things are, again, they're like really fundamental problems of there are some legitimate equities that need to be balanced. And so I think so the growth thing is a problem, but I think it's mostly a problem in developing countries that were not considered really that important. But hey, it's great if these people use it because it makes our growth numbers bigger, even if we're not making any more money. But then the company wouldn't invest properly in the right language skills, and the right operational capabilities and stuff like that. There are specific countries like Myanmar where there's all these really specific issues, like you can't hire people in the country because the bad stuff's being done by the government, or there's very few people who speak the right languages. But then you have other countries where that growth's been bad. In the US and in Europe, I think it's a lot of these problems are much more about like some legitimate legal equities and how do you live within these developed democracies' legal systems of all these people wanting different things. The growth is not as big of a deal.
Jakob Heher, let's see if your mic works today. Are you there? Uh-oh. Still seems like your mic isn't working. All right, I will once again read your question. Interested in more of Alex's views on attaching trustworthy information labels to posts. If one of the two major US political parties apparently makes voter suppression and election disinformation its party line, and I realize that is a generalizing statement, how do you fairly attach trustworthy information labels to it without immediately resulting in new accusations of anti-conservative bias? From a certain point of view, isn't choosing to correct misinformation by itself a partisan choice at that point?
Yes. It's not a partisan choice. I think this is something Facebook has to get over, is the idea. There's like a funny reversion here, is that generally conservatives are all about equality of opportunity, but not equality of outcomes, right? Of like, well, anybody could go to Harvard, right? And then obviously they don't pick up all of the things
except
that allow
Asian
them to
people.
get into Harvard.
Sorry. Except Asian people.
Okay, different. We're not going there. Yeah. Right. But like if they're not interested in quality outcomes, but when it comes to like content moderation stuff, they're all about equality of outcomes, right? And I think Facebook's just going to have to get past the fact that they're going to get criticized by conservatives because there's no quantitative data that shows that Facebook is bad for conservatives. In fact, a lot of conservative outlets, the Breitbarts, the Fox News, Franklin Graham, a bunch of conservatives do extremely well, or often in the most interacted with content on Facebook. Now, that doesn't mean as much as you might think in that of the Facebook products. The young people are on Instagram. And so, Instagram is probably, there's more engagement with more liberal stuff, but it's, even adjusted for age, conservatives just do fine, right? And so if they fairly apply the rules and they apply them on a per unit basis and the outcome is not fair, then that's life, right? And I think that's something that has actually, that fear has held the company back from acting in multiple situations.
And why are they so skittish about, I think this is a problem with both Facebook and Twitter, right? That they're so skittish about specifying how the algorithm works and what it's privileging and what it's, punishing, that it gives rise to this, suspicion. I literally, a friend of mine who's a kind of Trumpy conservative, tweeted the other day that, complaining that his tweets over the past week had generated X number of thousands of retweets, and there had been this level of engagement, and he had blank number of new followers, and yet he had lost followers in the aggregate. And the implication was that somehow he was being discriminated against by Twitter, when, of course, the obvious implication, to me anyway, was you excited a bunch of people and you pissed a bunch of other people off, and a bunch of people followed you and more people unfollowed you.
Also, those metrics are always hard to read, right? Like, there's a lot, like it's actually, I mean, I think the companies could do better here, but you'll have metrics on a dashboard where some of them are updated once a day and some of them are in real time and stuff like that. So it's easy to get in a place where you're confused.
Right. Particularly.
Is it Stuart Baker you're talking about? Because like every time I talk to him, it's like he totally believes that the algorithms are against conservatives.
No, so it was not Stuart Baker, actually. It was a think tank friend of mine. I believe it was Mike Duran. But it was similar in tone, although Stewart's is usually not directed at himself. He's not, Stewart has the general anxiety that conservatives are being disfavored on Twitter. He does not seem to have the specific pathology that he is being mistreated on Twitter.
Right. But I mean, isn't this like a conservative trope that like they're always oppressed, even if they control the Supreme Court, the presidency, the Senate, the largest news station? Like, I mean, it's just, I mean, this is something that's existed for years, decades, of like everybody is aligned against us, even when it's only against these incredible forces that are secretly making everything, which I think feeds in then to the people who take that really far, are kind of the QAnon people and the like, where you have like the really conspiratorial thinking of, it's not just like an open conspiracy between the media and the tech companies, but it's also something dark and dangerous.
Right. So I agree with that, although I do think there is an important kernel of truth in the conservative sense of besiegement, which is that the more elite the institution gets, the less likely it is to be friendly to conservatives.
Right.
And at least in cultural and academic and, Twitter and Facebook, your comments about them that, the workforce is overwhelmingly liberal is a good example of that. There is a kind of liberal ambience to elite institutions, unless they are specifically constructed to, engineer away from it somehow. But I think
which again, though, this is an equality of opportunity. Nothing, I've seen Tom Cotton talking about like, we got to cut off all this immigration, like high skilled immigration from China. And my thought was like, well, if he wants to go build a Silicon Valley in Arkansas with descendants of the Mayflower, then he should go ahead and try. But like, there's nothing stopping people who have more conservative, and there are successful conservatives in Silicon Valley, like Larry Ellison famously. They're often people in like, less in kind of the consumer space for some reason, but much more in enterprise, right? There's a bunch of enterprise companies that are actually pretty, they might be social, I would say more libertarian, right? But you'll have Republican supporting executives there.
Yeah. And I'm not, my point is only that when the nature of what the algorithm is selecting for and selecting against is opaque, it does give rise to that. It gives rise to all kinds of suspicions, right?
Yeah.
And I don't really understand why Facebook and Twitter are not very open about what's getting high up and low down in my feeds. I mean, I just don't see why that needs to be a deeply held state secret.
So what you see on Twitter or Facebook or YouTube is spectacularly complicated. And it's even a engineer at one of these companies, it is hard for them to really understand why any decision's been made. Like what's happened is that you're talking about layer upon layer of system, all of which are responsive to your individual actions and then are trained on people who are like you, right? And this is one of the great things about machine learning is nobody knows how the hell it really works, right? Like, it's
Right.
just statistics of like you're building statistical models to try to predict things based upon things that have happened in the past, and then trying to backfit those. That's all it is. But you end up, when you talk about the amount of data that's fed into these ML models, it's extremely difficult to predict why any one individual decision has been made. So I actually agree with you. I feel like this is a place where the companies could be more transparent. They're not going to ever put up a portal that allows your friend to understand why something happened. But I think they could create partnerships with academic institutions to do examinations of algorithms and then testing, right? So if you could plug in and you could do lots and lots of testing, you could test like, okay, great. These are two articles that are identical in all these ways, except one is a conservative bent, one's liberal and stuff. And so I think the companies could be more transparent. But I just think if you look at the outcomes, there is no evidence that Twitter or Facebook or YouTube has been bad for conservatives. In fact, there's a lot of conservative voices that would have only been in the talk radio world 20 years ago that can only exist right now, which I think is fun. That's also what some of the people who want more content control is they don't like some of those voices. And some of those people are really on the edge, but we gotta be like super duper careful about who gets to decide what is the Overton window of acceptable discourse and enforcing it. Cause like, I'm just very afraid of taking these almost trillion, or in some case, $1 trillion corporations, and then, just thinking it's completely reasonable for them to make all the decisions for our political discussions. That's why, something like the oversight board needs to happen. Why the hell it's taking longer to create a Facebook Supreme Court than it took to stand up the actual Supreme Court of the United States? Like, are we at the same?
That's not true. Well, Alex, that's not totally true. It took like 20 years to properly stand. It was 20 years between the start of the Supreme Court and when they issued Marbury versus Madison, which was like the thing that set up like judicial review and like gave it its real power. So like, but I'm not trying to like, you're right. You're not wrong. It's taking a long time, but like, that's not exactly correct. Like, it took longer.
So we've got to wrap up, but I do think, Kate and Alex, this disagreement flags the really important question about the oversight board. Should it have to ride circuit on horseback?
Right.
This is like the thing that the whole thing with the board launching was that they were waiting basically to like meet in person. And they wanted to meet in person with all of the members from like Yemen to Australia, to Taiwan, to India, to like London. They wanted them to all be in the same place at the same time. Obviously, COVID killed that, as it should, especially since a lot of them are over the age of 60. And so like there was a lot of reason for that not to happen. But basically, I don't know. People do forget how much technology fades into the background. I think I've mentioned this before. Laura DeNardis gave a talk on her book. I forget the name of it, but like her new book that basically said, she kind of made the point that technology is only technology until it becomes normalized. And then we don't even think of it as technology anymore. We just think of it as life. And so like, for example, cars, but also as she brings up, for example, indoor plumbing. Like the idea that was like a new technology that was much discussed and all of this kind of like, and I think that that's an important thing to kind of keep in mind as we do this. Like this is just an insane norm setting period and an insane rate. The thing that frustrates me is how quickly the media and people forget that we've been here before. And that's kind of exhausting. I don't know if you feel that way, Alex, but I just feel like everything from Innocence of Muslims video to the Nancy Pelosi video to Philando Castile. I just feel like we've been like there's some fresh hell every few months, and we keep getting renewed outrage, and I'm just not clear that anyone's moving forward.
I'm actually, I'm writing a book for my trust and safety class. And so for each of the sections, we have a history section. And it's amazing now that I'm digging into this with my research assistants. This is a great thing about being a fake professor, is I have all these smart grad students who are really interested in digging into this stuff. There's way more history in a bunch of these areas than you expect, right? Like there's all this history of like white supremacy on BBSs in the 80s, of, dial-up, of people faxing stuff, of Al-Qaeda, like it's, of hate speech back on electronic means. It's really interesting.
Non-consensual pornography has been a means of like harassing people from like way before dial-up, but it definitely got worse during dial-up. But then it was like, it's just, yeah, like all of these things have been around for, it's like, you can't, I'm sure that someone is drawing non-consensual porn in like a cave somewhere in France. Like,
but one of the problems is those of us in tech don't have all that history, right? And that's one of the things I'm trying to do with the class in the book. But I think like it's incumbent on people who go out of, if you're going to allow human beings to interact with each other, you need to understand the history of how that has gone poorly, right? And I do feel like the other thing, it's right, like we're repeating this with media and politicians over and over, but we're also repeating it with platforms, that every platform basically has to speed run Facebook's last 10 years in 6 months. Right. Like, and like TikTok is who we're seeing that from right now, that like TikTok keeps on taking these steps that are like straight up what you would have read about a mistake Twitter would have made in 2014. Right. Like, and like as an industry, we got to get better because we don't do this for other stuff. Like you don't have to reinvent the distributed database, you know, in 2020 from like how Google did it 10 years ago. You can jump to where they are right now. It's like on these issues, we got to get people as good at synchronizing with what the best practice is much more quickly.
I completely agree.
We're going to leave it there. So I chose the person who gets the last word today because the person had the best Zoom name around on the screen today, and that's Zombers. So Zombers, the floor is yours. You have the last word. But you got to unmute yourself. Well, Zombers may not be audible. So, all right.
Who are you picking?
Who are we picking? How about
we got two more good written questions if you want.
Do you want to ask? Should we bring in? So who asked the two more questions?
Matthew Chekhov.
We can give Matthew the last word. All right, Matthew Chekhov, you get the last word. Say something wise.
So my question for Alex is about encryption, speaking to his, I guess, chief security officer job at Facebook. So, you know, recently the bar DOJ has really been coming after end-to-end encryption. And in the last couple of weeks, especially because, you know, Barr was railing against Apple for not helping to unlock the iPhone of the terrorist. So I was wondering if you, like, first of all, how problematic do you think this attack on encryption is? Number two, doesn't matter since DOJ keeps getting into these devices anyway. And number three, as someone who I assume is a very, you know, strong advocate for encryption, how do you speak to these like 85-year-old senators about the importance of being able to not have a backdoor for their iPhone they barely understand?
All great questions. So Kate and I, do you have one of these, Kate? Did you bring this home?
No, I'm like, no, that like all of the things that I carried out of my apartment, that was not one of them.
So Kate and I participated in this event at the Department of Justice, which is part of Bill Barr building a case against end-to-end encryption, now using Section 230 as the hook. Right. So this is a different direction. Right. So one, talking about like things that have happened over and over again, this is like the battle that'll never end on encryption. Right. Like we keep on having it over and over and over again. But it is a little different now in that they're attacking it from some different directions. I think my feeling is that we've never, end-to-end encryption itself has never been in more peril than it is right now, much less because of the United States and much more because of other countries. The country where, you know, it's most in peril right now is India. But then even in like Europe, where they make lots of noise about caring about privacy, there's a lot of state demands that sometimes override what they say about privacy. And there are some countries that have considered some pretty aggressive stuff around safety that would, if not outlaw end-to-end encryption, make it effectively impossible. And that's, you know, the politicians have learned not to just touch the wire of I'm making encryption illegal. What they do is they create legal regimes that mean that if you're a big responsible company, if you're an Apple or a Facebook, and so Apple and Facebook are the biggest purveyors of end-to-end encryption in the world. So those are the two that really matter, that companies of that size could not ship end-to-end because of the liability they would take on a bunch of things. So they won't just outlaw encryption. So you still have like a Signal and other kind of stuff that, you know, folks like I who go to DEF CON will use. But you won't, billions of people won't have it every day. And I think that's a big risk. So, you know, when I talk to folks in Congress, and I still do this around encryption, I just talk about the incredible security benefits to us as a country, the benefits of us having a trustworthy technology environment. If you look at the 21st century, one of the big battles is going to be whose IT industry do you trust, the United States or China? Like, we're moving to this bipolar world where you have to pick your poison. You have to pick American companies or Chinese companies.
I mean, this was foreseen by Jack Goldsmith and Tim Wu. Like, this is the world in which the other person they'd put into the mix is Europe, which I would put into the mix still. But I think you're right.
But Europe on consumer technology, especially, or cloud technologies, Europe is not much of a factor. Right. Spotify is their number one. Of the top 20 internet companies by revenue, only one of them is European. Right. There's lots of Europeans working on tech. They all live within 10 miles of my house here. Right. They all have visas. The great brain drain from Europe is one of the things we don't think about when we think about immigration, but we do a really good job of recruiting their best and brightest. But anyway, I think end-to-end encryption is on a knife's edge. And I think we need to make the argument about having a regulatory environment that makes American tech trustworthy for the rest of the world, right? And so that means we have to have privacy regulation. We have to have appropriate antitrust, right? That actually addresses real things, not just you're too big. Addresses actual abuses of power. I think we need to encourage lots of mathematically proven privacy in the form of encryption. And that will let us compete in the long term against the Chinese tech industry. That's way more effective than trying to pinprick Huawei with little sanctions and the like. We just need to make American tech a much better brand through a regulatory structure. And then for those of us in tech, the other thing we got to do is when we build unencrypted products, we have to be honest about there are downsides, and then when possible, mitigate those downsides without violating the privacy guarantees we're giving people. And that's something our team at Stanford, we have a 50-page paper that is still sitting because all the conferences got canceled. But I think there are things that we can do to try to make encryption really useful for people who want to use it for good things and make it less useful for people who want to cause harm.
And your invitation to come on the Lawfare podcast and talk about that paper when you release it is still an open one, Alex.
Okay. In the Jungle Studio when it gets unmothballed?
Yeah, we call it the virtual Jungle Studio now because it's distributed wherever Zencaster can reach. But
right, perfect.
We are going to leave it there.
Alex, thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
And we will be back tomorrow. Who do we have tomorrow? Do we have a guest yet for tomorrow, Kate?
I just emailed Larry. He hasn't responded yet. Larry Lessig said that he wants to come on this week, but he's been delinquent in responding to email. But
I have our guest for Friday.
You do have a guest for Friday. Okay.
I do. Yeah. So
it'll either be Larry tomorrow or Thursday. And otherwise, I think I'm kind of enjoying this, revisiting people who have been a little bit on the podcast, but we haven't gotten to, because we didn't get to really have Virginia on fully before because she was with Mike Pesca. We didn't get to have Alex on fully because he was with Nate. So it's kind of really been nice to kind of circle back. And
yeah, maybe we should circle back and get
Mike and Nate.
We should go back over the early episodes and people who've been here for group sessions. We should bring in for individuals.
Yeah.
Anyway,
this was great.
We will do this again tomorrow. We will be back at 5. And until then, I'm going to do it myself this time, Kate.
Please, because people are mocking me. I looked at the YouTube comments and now I feel really bad about myself.
No, because the YouTube comments are by these two crazy anti-Semites who don't like Jews and who call you cupcake. Why do you engage with them?
They said that I dyed my hair.
I'm
like, trust me, I have not dyed my hair. I haven't showered or washed my hair and I've not dyed it.
but Kate, you're
I shouldn't have looked. I don't know. I'm having one of those days, Ben. It's one of those days. Anyways, give us the sign off, Ben.
Until, if you can't have fun and a thin layer of yellow dust settles over your world, in lieu of fun and through the dust, you can come hang out with us.
It's true. Bye, Alex.